The wind howled like a wolf across the frozen fields of South Dakota. It wasn't just another cold night, it was the kind of winter evening that made even adults tremble. The streets of the small town of Harrison were covered in ice, and the sky was painted a heavy gray that promised more snow by morning. Stores were closed early, lights dimmed, and most families had huddled indoors beneath layers of warmth. But in a modest neighborhood near the town's edge, the Smiths were just getting home from a long day. Inside their small, warm house, 6-year-old Emily kicked off her boots and jumped onto the couch. Her cheeks red from the cold and her blonde pigtails still wet with melted snow. She clutched something tightly, her favorite possession in the world, a worn pink fleece blanket named Rosie. The blanket had been a gift from her late grandmother, who used to tell her stories wrapped in its softness. Rosie had comforted Emily through scraped knees, scary dreams, and sick days. It was more than fabric. It was a friend. As Emily's mom, Claire, unpacked groceries and shook snow from her coat, she glanced out the frosted window. The bus stop just across the road caught her eye. There was someone standing there, a woman. No, to people, a woman, holding something. A baby. Claire squinted. The woman wasn't wearing a proper coat, just a thin shawl. The baby was wrapped in what looked like an old hoodie, hardly enough for this bitter weather. Claire's breath caught. That wasn't just discomfort, they were in danger. Emily, Claire said quietly, stay here, sweetheart. But Emily was already looking. She saw the baby's tiny hand slip out into the cold. Something in her heart tugged. Mommy, she needs Rosie, Emily whispered. Claire paused, conflicted. Honey, that blanket means the world to you. Emily didn't flinch. She walked over to the door, pulled on her boots again, and hugged Rosie to her chest. She needs it more. Claire didn't stop her. Something sacred was happening. Together, they crossed the icy street. The woman looked up, startled. She was young, maybe mid-20s, her skin a warm bronze beneath the wine burn, her long dark hair tucked beneath a thin knit hat. She rocked the baby gently, as if motion alone could keep it alive. I'm not begging, the woman said quickly, her voice raw. We missed the shelter. The bus won't come for another hour. Claire raised her hands in calm. You don't have to explain. We just wanted to help. Before she could say more, Emily stepped forward. She held out Rosie with both hands, as if offering something sacred. For your baby, she said simply. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the child, then the mother, then at the blanket. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she wrapped the pink fleece around her baby. The infant stirred slightly, nestling into the softness. Thank you, the woman whispered. Her name is Dakota. It means friend to everyone in Lakota. I'm Emily, the little girl said with a smile. Claire's eyes met the woman's. Do you want to come with us? Just to warm up? The woman hesitated. She had known more judgment than help in this town. But something in Claire's tone genuine. Steady felt different. I'm Ayanna, she said. I don't want to cause trouble. You're not, Claire said. You're saving your child. That's not trouble. Back at the Smith house, the fireplace crackled and the smell of soup filled the air. Ayanna sat with Dakota cradled in her arms, now peacefully asleep in the pink blanket. Emily stayed close, her eyes wide with curiosity and care. She had never seen someone like Ayanna before. There was something strong and quiet about her, something sad and brave at the same time. Claire handed Ayanna a cup of tea. Where were you headed? The shelter near the tribal clinic. Ayanna replied softly. They shut early tonight. We came from the reservation. My grandmother passed. I had to leave the housing we were in. Claire's heart ached. She had heard stories of how Native families were often displaced, But now she saw it firsthand in the exhausted face of a young mother, and the slow rise and fall of a sleeping baby's chest. That night, Ayanna and her baby stayed in the guest room. Claire made calls to local women's shelters, and Emily fell asleep whispering good night to Rosie even though Rosie wasn't with her anymore. The next morning brought even colder temperatures, but inside the Smith house, there was warmth not just from the fire or the blankets, but from something deeper. Ayanna was quiet at breakfast, grateful but unsure. Claire offered to drive her to the tribal clinic. Ayanna accepted, but before she left, she asked for a pen and a piece of paper. She scribbled something down and handed it to Claire. "It's my uncle's address. He's an elder on the reservation. I'll be okay." Claire nodded, though her eyes were heavy with concern. Emily came running to the door, cheeks flushed with excitement. "You'll bring Rosie back someday, right?" Ayanna smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I think Rosie is where she belongs now." As the car drove off, Emily stood by the window. She didn't know what had just happened, not entirely, but something felt different in her heart, bigger, like maybe she had given away more than a blanket and received something far more important in return. What none of them knew was that this one simple act, one blanket, one child's kindness, would ripple across lives and tribal borders. The photo Claire had taken quietly, showing Emily handing the blanket to a baby at the bus stop, would soon go viral. It would stir up conversations long overdue. It would reach a tribe who had been forgotten, and it would awaken something sacred, something buried deep within the people who had once lost everything, but who still knew how to say thank you in a way the world would never forget. The snowstorm didn't let up the next day. Roads remained icy, and schools across the county were closed. Emily, still in her pajamas, sat curled up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her. She held a pillow instead of Rosie, her beloved blanket now wrapped around a baby she barely knew. Something in her felt hollow, yet proud, like she had said goodbye to a part of herself in exchange for something better. Claire walked in with 2 cups of hot cocoa and placed one beside her daughter. "You miss Rosie, don't you?" Emily nodded slowly, stirring her cocoa without sipping. "Do you think the baby's warm?" Claire smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "I think she's warmer than she's ever been. Because of you." Emily looked up. "Will I ever see her again? The baby, I mean." Claire hesitated, unsure of the answer. Maybe life has a way of bringing people back around when it matters most. Across town, Ayanna sat in a tribal clinic located just outside the reservation. It was a modest building, its paint chipped and its resources limited, but it had always been a place of refuge. The nurse, a kind Lakota woman named Nita, had recognized Ayanna immediately and helped her settle in. "You made it through the storm?" Nita asked while gently checking Dakota's temperature. "That child of yours is a fighter." "She's not the only one," Ayanna whispered, adjusting the pink blanket still wrapped around her daughter. Nita smiled at the sight of it. "That's not from around here." "No," Ayanna said softly. "It's from an angel." She told Nita about the little girl who had given up her own comfort for a stranger, about Claire's kindness, about the warm house and how they'd welcomed her without asking for anything. Nita grew quiet. She had seen many acts of cruelty and few of compassion. "Did you get their names, Emily?" Ayanna said. "She's 6, but she's got a heart the size of this whole state." That day, Nita posted on a small Facebook group for Lakota mothers. A young non-native girl named Emily gave her only blanket to a freezing Lakota baby last night. That child saved a life. We don't know her last name or where she's from, but if you hear this, your kindness won't be forgotten. She included a photo Ayanna had taken that morning, Dakota smiling up at her mother. snuggled in a bright pink fleece blanket. The caption read, "Wrapped in love, not just fabric." The post didn't stay small for long. By that evening, it had been shared over 5,000 times across Native and non-Native communities. Journalists picked it up. People from across the country started asking, who was this girl? Where did it happen? Could one act of kindness really still matter? Back in Harrison, Claire's phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the day. At first, she ignored the notifications. Then she opened one message from a friend. "Is this Emily?" Photo attached. A blurry shot of Emily at the bus stop holding Rosie out with both hands. Claire's stomach turned. How had this gotten online? She opened Facebook. The post had been shared by a Native women's support group, and now it was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, news blogs. She called Ayanna. "Did you post a photo?" I told the nurse. Ayanna replied, worry in her voice. "She must have shared it." Claire sighed but didn't sound angry. "People are looking for you. For Emily, it's going viral." "I never meant for this to happen." "I know," Claire said gently. "But maybe it's not such a bad thing." Within 48 hours, the story had become national news. CNN Renee segment called "The Pink Blanket That Saved a Life." NPR interviewed Claire and Emily by phone. And most powerfully, several Native leaders began speaking out, not just about the act of kindness, but about what it revealed. Chief Raymond Tall Elk of the Oglala Lakota made a live video from the reservation. "That blanket may seem like a small gesture, but to us, it means something profound. In a world that often turns away from indigenous suffering, this child saw a baby in the cold and chose to act. She didn't ask about race, history, or politics. She simply gave. But we cannot let winter passed, but the warmth ignited by a single act never faded. Even as the snow melted and trees began to bud again, the story of Emily and the pink blanket Rosie continued to ripple far beyond Harrison or the Rose Creek Reservation. In schools across the country, teachers began sharing the story with their students. Children wrote letters to Native communities. Some even collected warm blankets and winter coats to donate to tribes. Parents who had never spoken to their children about Native history were suddenly Googling words like displacement, treaty rights, and intergenerational trauma. And in Washington, D.C., the story had reached the ears of someone who would become the unexpected catalyst for real change. Senator Martha Glenn of Minnesota. Martha was no stranger to Native issues. Her state included 7 reservations, and she had met with tribal leaders before, but she'd never felt deeply connected to their struggle. Until the day she read a letter from a 3rd-grade girl in her district. "Dear Senator Glenn, my class read about Emily who gave her blanket to a Native baby. We want to help too. Can you make a law that makes sure no babies are cold again?" There was no political spin in the handwriting, no hidden agenda, just raw innocence. It made Martha pause. She contacted her staff. "Get me everything we have on tribal winter housing programs, emergency aid, and anything to do with child health on reservations today." Her assistant looked surprised. "Is this about the pink blanket story?" "It's about what we haven't done," Martha said, "and what we're going to fix." By April, Senator Glenn had co-authored a bipartisan bill titled the Blanket Promise Act. It was simple but powerful. Emergency heating and shelter grants for reservations during extreme weather, a federal inventory of homes lacking winter insulation on tribal lands, permanent funding for tribal winter clinics, and maternal health transport, a clause to create blanket banks, programs for collecting and distributing warm clothing across Native communities. Named in honor of Rosie, the bill included a small but deeply symbolic gesture, a dedication clause that read, inspired by the act of 6-year-old Emily Smith of Harrison, Missouri, whose blanket saved a life and reminded us what humanity truly looks like. Back in Harrison, Emily wasn't following politics. She was now in the 2nd grade, learning multiplication, losing teeth, and sometimes doodling Rosie in the margins of her notebooks. But her life had changed in other ways, Claire noticed. At first, people at the grocery store stopped to smile at them. Teachers asked Emily to speak in front of assemblies. Letters began arriving, hundreds of them from kids around the country. One was from a girl named Jasmine in Arizona, who wrote, "I'm native too. Nobody ever talks about us, but you saw us. Thank you. I want to be like you when I grow up." Claire read that letter 3 times. Then she looked at her daughter. "Do you know what you did?" Emily shrugged, embarrassed. "I gave away my blanket." "No," Claire said softly. "You gave a reason for the world to care." Ayanna's life had transformed to that. She now lived in a small, warm apartment just off the reservation, thanks to support from a tribal relocation program that had received a massive boost in donations. After Emily's story went viral, she had enrolled in a local college's early education program, determined to become a preschool teacher, something she had always dreamed of before life got hard. Lakota was thriving. She crawled faster than most babies could walk and had recently begun babbling nonstop. Her first word, much to Ayanna's surprise, wasn't Mama. It was Roro, a nickname she'd given to the pink blanket that stayed tucked in her crib every night. To honor everything that had happened, Ayanna started a blog titled Roro's Legacy, where she documented her journey as a single Native mother rebuilding her life, and highlighted stories from other Native women who were rising above adversity. The blog gained traction fast. Within a few months, it had 50,000 followers. In June, Claire received a formal letter from Senator Glenn's office. "You and your daughter are cordially invited to the U.S. Capitol for the ceremonial presentation of the Blanket Promise Act before Congress." Claire was stunned. Emily, eating cereal at the kitchen table, asked innocently, "Do I get to see the president?" Claire laughed. "Probably not, but maybe you'll help make history." The Capitol was enormous. The marble floors echoed with every step, and the ceilings seemed to rise forever. Claire and Emily were given a special tour. Then, in a room filled with flashing cameras, microphones, and dignitaries, they were introduced to the Congressional Committee on Tribal Affairs. Senator Glenn rose to speak. "Today, we're not here for ceremony. We're here for substance. We're here to honor a promise, not just the promise made in this legislation, but the promise shown in a little girl's heart. Emily Smith, would you please come forward?" Emily stood nervously. Claire gave her hand a gentle squeeze. The room fell completely silent as Emily walked up to the podium. Her speech had been written out for her by Claire, but Emily spoke in her own words. "I didn't know her name. I just knew she was cold. My mom always says we help people when we can, because that's what good people do. I didn't know a blanket could do all this, but I'm happy. I hope the baby is warm forever." The room erupted in applause, and just like that, the Blanket Promise Act passed unanimously through committee. That summer, something magical happened. A documentary team began working on a film called Rosie, the blanket that changed America. It followed Emily, Ayanna, and the Rose Creek community. The crew spent time interviewing tribal elders, exploring the gaps in winter housing, and capturing the heartwarming ripple effect of Emily's kindness. During the final scenes, the team filmed Emily visiting a newly opened blanket bank on the Standing Rock Reservation. Piles of colorful blankets lined the shelves, donated from every corner of the country. An elder handed Emily a note that read, "This is not the end. This is the re-beginning. By autumn, Claire and Ayanna had become close friends, almost like sisters. They spoke weekly, sharing photos of their daughters and discussing the future. At one point, Claire asked, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" Ayanna smiled. "Funny, I've already started one. It's called When the Wind Carried a Blanket. Children's book." "Yep, for all the kids like Emily and all the babies like Dakota." Claire nodded. "Count me in as your first reader." One morning, while walking to school, Emily noticed a boy sitting alone on the curb, his hoodie too thin for the crisp October air. Without hesitation, she unzipped her backpack and handed him her extra jacket. He stared in surprise. She smiled. "It's what Rosie would want." And just like that, the sparks apart for, from the fire pit to the halls of power. Rose Creek Reservation hadn't seen such excitement in decades. News trucks began rolling into town shortly after the documentary. Rosie, the Blanket That Changed America, aired on PBS and Netflix. With cameras in hand and journalists buzzing with curiosity, the once quiet reservation became the center of a national conversation about kindness, neglect, and hope. But amid the attention, the people of Rose Creek stayed grounded. The tribe had known winters harsher than this one, and though the snow had thawed, the struggle for survival in forgotten communities was far from over. The elders saw Emily not just as a child hero but as a spark. The question wasn't what had happened, but what could happen next. Chief Raymond Tall Bear stood before the tribal council with a paper in hand. "This is a request from Washington. They want to know if we'll allow a delegation from Congress to visit and consult about how to build more blanket banks and better emergency services." The room buzzed. Some were excited, others skeptical. An elder named Grace Redfeather spoke first. "We've seen their promises before, but this time, they come because of a child who acted from the heart. Maybe it's time to invite them into ours." The council agreed. A month later, the community prepared to host a congressional delegation, including Senator Martha Glenn, for the first time in its history. Emily and her mother were invited to return to Rose Creek for the visit. Claire hesitated at first. "Are you sure they really want us back?" Ayanna answered over the phone, her voice warm and steady. "You're family now. Rosie's part of our story, and so are you." The day of the visit arrived. Emily wore a blue dress with little feather patterns, gifted to her by one of the Lakota seamstresses. Rosie, now carefully framed and preserved in a glass case, had been temporarily loaned to the tribal museum, where it now sat on display with the words, "The blanket that warmed a nation, donated in love, protected in spirit." Senator Glenn arrived with a small team of aides and media liaisons. Despite being used to public appearances, she looked genuinely moved as she stepped out of the black SUV and saw the hand-painted signs along the road. "Welcome, blanket builders." "Thank you, Emily. We remember, we rise." The tribe greeted the guests in full ceremony, complete with traditional songs, dances, and a fire pit blessing. Ayanna, carrying Dakota on her hip, joined Emily and Claire near the sacred fire, where elders told the origin stories of their people. Later, everyone gathered in the tribal community hall, where tables were lined with warm bread, venison stew, and sweet berry pudding. Senator Glenn stood to speak. She didn't use a prepared speech. "We come today not to give lectures, but to listen. This is your story, your land, your people. Emily gave us a reason to pay attention, but you've given us the courage to keep paying attention." Then she turned. That night, a vigil was held on the National Mall. Thousands gathered, holding real blankets and candles. Rosie's image was projected onto the side of the Smithsonian Building. Tribal dancers from across the country performed under the moonlight, while speakers read letters from elders who had never expected to live to see change. The next day, President Julius Serrano signed the Blanket Promise Act into law on live television. This law is more than funding. It is a pledge that no child, no elder, no family should ever be left in the cold forgotten. We make this promise today not just because of policy, but because a little girl reminded us what it means to care. She turned to Emily, standing beside her. "Thank you for being our North Star." As flashbulbs lit up the rose garden, Emily turned to Claire and whispered, "Can we go home now?" "Yes, baby, we can." Back in Missouri, life resumed its steady rhythm. But everything had changed. Claire had returned to her part-time nursing shifts. Emily was back in second grade. Her classmates now called her Blanket Girl, a nickname she both cherished and tried to ignore. Fame hadn't changed her much. She still played with her toy dinosaurs and built snowmen on the weekends. But the letters kept arriving from children in Alaska, thanking her for warm boots they'd received, from an elder in Montana who had spent his first winter in a newly insulated home, from a mother in South Dakota whose infant survived a blackout thanks to the emergency heater she'd received through the new program. Emily kept them all in a scrapbook labeled The Warm Place. Meanwhile, Ayana's blog continued to grow. She published weekly essays on Native motherhood, resilience, and community organizing. She was offered a book deal, and the working title was simply Rosie. The Rose Creek Reservation had undergone noticeable change. The Tribal Council built the first fully winterized emergency center with federal funds. Roads were resurfaced. A cultural preservation initiative was launched. And every year on the anniversary of Emily's gift, they held Rosie Day, a celebration of youth-led compassion. A new initiative was even being piloted, a tribal youth ambassador program named Warm Hearts Rising, inspired by Emily and Dakota's story. Its mission was to identify and support young changemakers in underserved areas. One bitter morning in late December, Claire received a surprise letter. It was from Senator Glenn. "Dear Claire, I've been invited to speak at a global winter relief conference in Geneva next month. They want to hear about Rosie, about Emily, about your strength as a mother. I would be honored if you and Emily would come with me, not as political guests but as co-authors of change. Yours in warmth, Martha." Claire stared at the letter in disbelief. She turned to Emily, now curled up on the couch with a book. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "how do you feel about visiting Switzerland?" Emily looked up. "Do they have snow?" "Lots of it." Emily grinned. "Then Rosie would like it." And so, just months after a single pink blanket passed from one set of hands to another, the ripples of that gesture continued across oceans and nations, a movement born from love, driven by need, and cemented in policy. From a bench in a blizzard to the halls of Congress, to the world stage, Rosie had gone further than anyone imagined. But perhaps the most important journey she made was this. She traveled into the hearts of people who had forgotten that even in the coldest nights, warmth could begin with a child's hands. And somewhere in the world, on a stormy night, a mother pulled a thick new blanket over her baby, looked out the frosted window, and whispered, "Thank you, Emily. Thank you for seeing us." The wind howled, the fire crackled, and the promise held strong. Years passed, seasons came and went. Yet one thing remained constant in the hearts of all who remembered: the story of Rosie. The pink blanket that warmed more than a freezing child, it warmed a nation's conscience. Emily grew, the little girl who once gave her only blanket away to a shivering native baby was no longer just a child with big eyes and a soft heart. By the time she was 13, she had already visited over 20 states, spoken at conferences, stood on international stages, and met global leaders who bowed their heads in awe of her story. But fame had never been the goal, and neither had applause. She still carried Rosie's memory wherever she went. In every town, school, or tribal nation she visited, she listened. She heard stories of pain and resilience, of hardship and healing, of generations that had endured far too much winter with too little warmth. When Emily turned 16, she launched a non-profit called Rosie's Reach, a program dedicated to youth-led winter aid efforts. Instead of only sending blankets, they helped train young volunteers from across the U.S. to work directly with Native and underserved communities. The motto was simple: warmth is a right, not a privilege. One of the first major Rosie's Reach initiatives was building a winter dormitory in Alaska for displaced Indigenous families. Emily traveled there with her mom and Dakota, who, by now, was a tall, cheerful 10-year-old who called Emily my other sister. Ayanna had invited them both to see the ribbon-cutting ceremony. As snowflakes dusted the newly built structure, children wrapped in fresh coats played around the building, their laughter echoing through the mountains. Inside, elders sat sipping soup by a new heating system powered by renewable energy. And on the wall, framed in birchwood, was a replica of Rosie. She's traveled far. One of the elders whispered to Emily, "But she's home," Emily replied. Ayanna approached, carrying a handmade quilt. Unlike Rosie, it wasn't pink or frayed. It was woven with intricate patterns, bearing symbols from various Native nations who had partnered with the project. In the center, stitched with golden thread, were the words, "For the girl who gave warmth to the world." "This is for you," Ayanna said, gently placing it on Emily's shoulders. Tears filled Emily's eyes. "I didn't do it alone. None of us ever do." Ayanna smiled. Back in Washington, the Blanket Promise Act had grown from a bill to a national movement. Annual reviews and audits ensured funds were being properly allocated. A committee composed of tribal representatives had been formed to oversee winter relief operations. Every major weather emergency in tribal lands was now met with swift and well-coordinated aid. But the fight wasn't over. Claire, now a published author, used her platform to educate the public about Native history and the gaps in policy that still needed addressing. She co-wrote a memoir with Ayanna titled Blanket Truths, which became a national bestseller. It told both their stories, one of a white mother raising a daughter who believed in kindness, and one of an indigenous mother fighting to protect her child in a system that too often looked away. The book was used in classrooms across America, sparking discussions about poverty, injustice, and allyship. As Rosie's story became part of American culture, it was immortalized in art, in film, in music. A popular streaming network released a documentary called The Blanket That Spoke, which followed the journey of that single act of compassion from a cold bus stop to the halls of government. But for Emily, none of that was as important as the people she met. Like Lily, a Navajo girl who started her own winter drive at age 9 after watching Emily speak, or Malcolm, a foster kid in Wisconsin who donated his only extra coat after learning about Rosie. Or Mrs. Baker, a 70-year-old woman from Detroit who knit 50 blankets in one winter to donate to the cause. Each story reminded Emily why it all began. At 18, Emily stood once again on the steps of the Capitol. This time, she wasn't testifying, she was receiving the National Humanitarian Youth Medal, the youngest ever to receive it. But as always, she kept her speech short. "I accept this not just for myself, but for every child who gave what they could, for every elder who held on through the cold, and for Rosie, who never had a voice, but who spoke louder than any of us ever could." The crowd stood in thunderous applause. That evening, during a quiet dinner with Claire and Ayanna, Emily whispered something they hadn't heard before. "I want to become a lawyer. Not for power, but to make sure stories like yours don't get ignored anymore." Claire squeezed her hand. Ayanna smiled. "Then you'll do it, and we'll be there every step." 10 years later, the world had changed. Emily was now Emily Hart, working as a civil rights attorney specializing in indigenous rights. She lived part-time on tribal land, part-time in D.C., and full-time in Purpose. Rosie's reach had grown into an international NGO, and Dakota, now in college, was one of its directors. Every winter, Emily visited new reservations, walking with youth leaders through their communities, listening, supporting, empowering. One winter morning, during her visit to a remote Minnesota reservation, a young girl approached her. The girl had bright eyes, unruly curls, and held out a blanket. "My mom said I should give this to someone who needs it more than me. She told me about you." Emily took the blanket, heart swelling. "What's your name?" "Rosie." The girl smiled. Emily froze. "That's my name." Tears filled Emily's eyes, and in that moment, time folded. The story had come full circle, from the hands of a girl to a baby, from a family to a nation, from a blanket to a movement. Rosie's warmth never faded. It only grew past from hand to hand, heart to heart, across lands and laws, through snow and silence, carrying with it a promise: "We see you, we care, you are not forgotten." And as snowflakes fell gently from the sky, Emily whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for beginning it all."